damage and has the potential for some of the largest earthquakes in the nation. We'll look at three of the state's largest population centers, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, and share some earthquake information that may surprise you. You'll see how the major earthquake threats we faced in California are not just the quakes themselves, but the potential harm done to infrastructure, both the built and wired infrastructure, and to the communities connected by the fault lines in California. We'll talk about how we're still learning from past earthquakes and how that information is making our lifeline systems for water, gas, and electricity, as well as telecommunications, more secure. In addition, we'll talk about how billions have been invested in seismic upgrades and how that investment is expected to save hundreds of billions in structural damage in the future. Research has shown that the direct economic benefit of investing in mitigating earthquake damage by retrofitting soft-story apartment buildings, for example, can return $13 for every dollar spent. The U.S. Resiliency Council is a nonprofit founded 11 years ago, working to improve communities' resilience one building at a time. We use the building performance rating systems, educational programs such as the Resilience Advantage, and coalition building with key stakeholders to make our built environment, your homes and buildings and businesses, more sustainable, prosperous, and resilient. If you want to learn more about the resilience movement, please go to our website at usrc.org. So with that, I'd like to make some acknowledgments and thank you. The first thank you, of course, is to our series sponsor, Optimum Seismic. I want to particularly thank Ali Sahabi, the CFO at Optimum Seismic, for his just tireless promotion of the work that we've been doing and of resilience throughout California. This series would not have been possible without him. And now I'd like to thank our major partners, organizations which have worked for years to focus attention on the vital message of earthquake resilience for our business community, particularly the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, Los Angeles County Business Federation and Economic Development Corporation, the U.S. Resiliency Council, and Optimum Seismic. I'd also like to thank all the various champions that have helped make this series and promote this series over the past year. They've done a great amount of work in spreading the word about the Resilience Advantage series, and one of our guests today, Dr. Christine Goulet, represents the Southern California Earthquake Center, and we're particularly thankful for all the work that organization has done to spread the word. So, in this episode, you're about to see, it'll explore some of the earthquake threats to our buildings, communities, and the people in California, and how we can all be made safer and more resilient from the disruptive impacts of earthquakes. As we start the video, I'd like to thank our friends at Compassion Unlimited for their hard work and artistry in weaving together these dozens of virtual interviews, visuals, and case studies. So we hope you enjoy this episode on California earthquake threats, and stay tuned afterwards for a very informative discussion with our panelists. So enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese. In this series, we're exploring what resilience means to the long-term sustainability of our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and now even pandemic. In this episode, we consider how disaster resilience is being redefined to include the changes in cost, severity, and frequency of natural disasters that we're witnessing around the world. We'll also look at how this visible shift is being viewed through the economic lens on a national scale. We know that money spent now saves far more in future recovery costs. But how is that knowledge changing our planning and actions? Let's look at three of the major population centers in California: Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, and see what types of impacts may occur from earthquakes in those areas. When people think about large earthquakes in California, they often focus on the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. That quake and the fires that followed killed some 4,000 people and devastated much of the city by the bay. What followed was the physical and economic recovery that took decades. Today, our ability to anticipate the impacts of future earthquakes in heavily populated areas is based primarily on previous events like the 1971 Sylmar quake, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, or the Northridge earthquake in 1994, and what we can model based on those past events. But changes in modern urban infrastructure, made vulnerable by multiple layers of interdependencies between water, electricity, gas, and other lifelines, as well as a growing dependence on internet and telecommunications services, have thrown many of our assumptions into question. In 2018, the U.S. Geological Survey developed the Haywired scenario to address those exact concerns. The Haywired earthquake scenario was designed to model and study impacts on the San Francisco Bay Area from a repeat of the magnitude 7 earthquake on the Hayward Fault that occurred in 1868. The Haywired scenario provided local and state governments with some clarity and recommendations about how to prepare, not just in terms of physical hazards and impacts, but also to take into account environmental impacts related to fires worsened by water interruptions, lifeline and power grid interruptions, and with them, internet and telecommunications failures. A key takeaway from the scenario was that the tens of billions of dollars that the Bay Area region cities and utilities have already invested in seismic upgrades, retrofits, and replacement of older buildings and infrastructure since the Loma Prieta earthquake can potentially save hundreds of billions of dollars of structural damage, but still may be insufficient to meet the other challenges created by such an event. Scenarios like Haywired focus attention on measures that can be taken to make our built environment safer and ensure economic stability. These scenarios can only be successful when the information going in is based on sound research data. Christine Goulet is the Executive Director for Applied Science at the Southern California Earthquake Center, SCEC. I asked her about how her work in ground motion modeling can help protect infrastructure elements, from critical facilities like power plants and dams to other vulnerabilities like housing, transportation, telecommunication, and information grids.
Even if we think about this ground motion problem in this simplified way, there's a lot of places where we can better understand, model the physics, and reduce the uncertainties. And this reduction of uncertainty that we do through our research helps us having more accurate ground motions. In the end, if you have more accurate ground motions, you do a better design that's more appropriate for the demand. If we don't really know and we have a wide range, well, your ground motions could be this or that, then you're going to have a design that might be over or under designed, and it's not a good use of resources.
Are there key locations that should be targeted that would have a greater impact on a quick recovery?
If we were to have a very large earthquake on the San Andreas Fault right now, and that's what the rest of the world thinks of Southern California. To the city of LA, in terms of structural damage, might not be the worst. Maybe Puente Hills, that is straight under the city, is the biggest issue. However, San Andreas has the possibility to rupture the water supply system in multiple places, and this could take months to get repaired and get water back in Los Angeles. So different scenarios could affect different parts of society in a different way. If you think broadly, California could have an earthquake pretty much anywhere. So everywhere is at risk for a fairly large earthquake. And again, you don't have to be experiencing a very large earthquake to have large consequences, because if even a magnitude 6.7 like Northridge was fairly small, but it occurred right under the valley, so it caused a lot of damage and casualties and so on.
Ross Stein is the co-founder and CEO of Temblor, whose mission is to help people understand their seismic risk. When I spoke with him, he talked about how mitigation doesn't just impact building safety, but rather it's a complex web of interdependent actors and actions.
So imagine you're a business. You previously thought that your earthquake exposure was your building. You know, you put all your employees in your building, and you need to concern yourself with whether or not your building is sufficiently resilient to earthquake shaking and that nobody will be injured. Well, guess what? Over the last year and a half, we haven't even been in that building. Your employees are still working, but they're distributed all around the community. So suddenly, a problem that was really a point problem What's the issue for this building in its location with its proximity to faults and earthquakes has changed. It's now a portfolio. It's 1,000 points of light. It's all these locations, the locations of your most important asset, which is not your building, it's your people. And they're spread around. So the whole business of understanding corporate risk now looks a lot more like an insurance portfolio, because you have to concern yourself with everybody's resilience.
When we look at the earthquake threats facing California, everyone thinks about the San Andreas Fault, the big one. But your research and risk assessments has shown that there are scenarios in which smaller faults can cause greater damage. Can you tell me about that?
We all know about the San Andreas, and for good reason. It's the most active fault. It slips at a higher rate than all the other faults in the state. And so, by and large, over the long haul, it's going to produce more large earthquakes than other faults. But it is by no means the only fault we've got. The state is laced with many faults of many orientations. To pull one out of a hat that would be important, the Newport-Inglewood Fault, which gave us the 1933 Long Beach magnitude 6.5 earthquake, that ruptures all the way through central Los Angeles, right up to Century City and Beverly Hills. And there it joins the Santa Monica Malibu Fault, which heads west, and the Hollywood Fault, which heads east. So a situation we could imagine is a large earthquake, let's say a magnitude 7 on the Newport-Inglewood Fault, triggering another large earthquake on the Hollywood Fault. And then in that sequence of events, we would have hit Long Beach, Marina del Rey, Century City, Beverly Hills, and downtown Los Angeles. So the likelihood of ruptures in those faults are much lower than the San Andreas. But the consequences of even a small earthquake on those faults is much higher than the San Andreas.
The notion that smaller faults like the Newport-Inglewood Fault can trigger other faults in Santa Monica and Hollywood and cause greater damage than the more well-known San Andreas Fault is news to most people, but not to Ken Odell at MHP Engineers.
So we're starting to connect San Diego to Newport and to Palos Verdes a little bit more directly. That really raises the question as to the San Diego mechanism is not based on a short fault anymore. It's now based on a much larger opportunity. You know, the Northridge earthquake in 1994 was a fairly localized event in the San Fernando Valley. There was damage scattered as it came back into the LA basin, but it was still a localized event. With San Diego having a longer fault rupture potential, we're now looking at earthquakes that are going to impact not just communities, but regions. And those regions are going to be stretched not only in damage, but also in response. Resources are now going to be taxed when the community that's been affected is much greater. I think the greatest earthquake threat that faces California is indifference and reliance. We can't scare people, we have to inform people. When we scare people, they tend to become indifferent. It's overwhelming, they don't know what to do with it. That is a huge threat to earthquake survivability in California. The other one is reliance. I think too often we rely on the code. We rely on our engineers or our architects or our public officials to set a standard. And by setting that standard, we rely on the standard being good enough. And so I believe that both of those components take away the important need for the end user, the client, the owner, the developer, the tenant, to have a stake in the conversation.
Getting every stakeholder into the conversation can't just happen by itself, and it can't just come together when the government starts the conversation. When I spoke to Professor Frank Zerunian at USC, he explained that the path to resilience requires something greater than just the people involved.
We will not be able to respond to disasters but for governance, in other words, the collaboration of the various sectors coming together at various stages pre and post disaster to address the issue. Indeed, government actually has a substantial role in this orchestra of various actors coming together to govern. So it's critical for government to be the conductor of that orchestra, if you will, in order to make sure that the other sectors not only are facilitated, but facilitated in a proper way to make sure there's transparency, accountability, efficiency, effectiveness, and yields results, which is what we call good governance.
To learn more about ways to improve resilience by focusing on both hazard mitigation and recovery in disaster situations, I spoke to Lori Schumann. Lori is the Senior Programs Director of National Initiatives at Enterprise Community Partners. She has personal experience in dealing with concurrent disaster recovery, having worked in Puerto Rico, which has dealt with crippling earthquakes and hurricanes.
In some communities in Puerto Rico that are lower income, those communities experienced catastrophic failure of their homes because those homes were not braced, they were not bolted, they were not built to code. And right down in another community right next to Guanica, for example, in Puerto Rico, in Ponce, we had a community where not all of the infrastructure failed and not all of the households lost their homes because there was code in place and fortification of this infrastructure. So we can take a similar community adjacent to one another and you apply mitigation principles to this community and good code and good standard of operations and maintenance, and it survives and the other community doesn't. So we know what works. We know code saves. We know brace and bolt saves. We just have to make it accessible to the communities that need it the most.
There is never a one-size-fits-all solution. How do you see federal assistance helping different regions based on their unique needs, like hurricanes in the Southeast and earthquakes and wildfires in California?
You know, when we look at vulnerability of a community, let's take a community in Los Angeles that may be very prone to seismic disturbance. The definition of vulnerability of a community is in large part informed by several factors. Fortification and the state of the building condition. Is there infrastructure in place that needs critical servicing? These factors contribute to a community's vulnerability and exposure to risk. And the way that we look at protecting communities is by trying to figure out how can we ensure that infrastructure and housing is in a better condition, that it is fortified, that it is braced and bolted, that there is infrastructure in the community that's flexible, that gas lines don't break, that water lines don't break, that the grid stays online. This requires a significant level of investment. Reducing infrastructure exposure will equate to a safer community when there is an earthquake.
And what is the view about the value of investing in mitigation?
Avoiding disaster and avoiding the trauma of disaster should be our primary focus in this nation. The avoided costs of a disaster should be a preeminent concern when we're considering investing in infrastructure and housing. When we deal with an event such as an earthquake or a flood or any major peril, the amount of funding put into repairing is just a sliver of what the costs are to a community.
Earthquakes happen in many areas of the nation. In California, their impacts will be felt in large population centers, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from other parts of the country or from people who deal with other kinds of natural disasters. Roderick Scott is a certified floodplain manager at L&R Resources in Louisiana. He became a pioneer in the use of federal and state income tax credits for the rebuilding of historical properties.
Basically spent 30 years as a general contractor and then came down to New Orleans after Katrina and Rita and took part in elevating some 36,000 homes in Louisiana now. And my little hometown across from New Orleans, Mandeville, last 4 weeks ago, and Ida has been working at flood mitigating its buildings since Katrina. And we've gone from 750 flood claims after Katrina for $25 million. We only had 64 flooded buildings this time. It's unbelievable. It works. And we've got to have buildings that don't flood. We've got to have buildings that the roofs don't blow off and the fire doesn't get them, and they don't collapse in earthquakes. And we're not talking about building all new buildings for this. We have millions of existing buildings we have to retrofit. And imagine the jobs that we create by doing this in a time where we need more employment and more jobs.
In January 2021, Congress passed the STORM Act, which will provide additional funding for disaster mitigation.
January 1st, the STORM Act was passed, which is a multi-hazard mitigation loan. It's for flood and wind and earthquake and fire. None of us planned in our ownership of these properties, our investment in these properties, to have to come back and retrofit our buildings. And the idea behind this resilience revolving loan is that it would be provided and attached to the property taxes, just like a PACE. In PACE, it's called Property Assessed Clean Energy Loan, but we're going to do resilience. So this way, we're going to save millions of properties across the country.
How would you see a model like this working in the case of seismic disasters?
You know, this property assessed model of financing is transferable. It's like a forklift. I can take the pallet from over here from flood, and I can go right over into earthquake, and we can start bolting and bracing buildings with this financing model that we've created that, you know, has long been needed and is finally starting to come to reality.
As we've learned today, the major earthquake threats we are facing in California are not just the quakes themselves, but the potential harm done to infrastructure, both built and wired, and to the communities connected by these fault lines. Research has shown the direct economic benefit of investing in mitigating earthquake damage by retrofitting soft-story apartment buildings, for example, can return $13 for every dollar spent. Throughout the course of this series, we have spoken to experts about many aspects of the resilience story and learned that most of the answers are already in our hands. We've learned that retrofitting existing buildings is both affordable and practical, and that new performance-based design can bring newer buildings in cities back online just days after an earthquake. We've learned that public policies are evolving to encourage resilience. We've learned that one of the most important elements of achieving true resilience is sharing information and the building of a community of stakeholders who share the same goal. The U.S. Resiliency Council is committed to bringing together these stakeholders to form a movement of like-minded people who see the importance of resilience, the benefit of proactive planning, modeling, and resilience programs, investments, and incentives. If there's one thing I hope people can take away from this series, it's that our guests and others like them are already working to deal with the threats presented by natural hazards and build a more resilient future. Hopefully, we will all continue working actively to make sure that the future natural hazard events do not become disasters. Thank you for joining me on the Resilience Advantage.
Well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It was eye-opening, certainly for me, learning about the faults in Southern California. I focus so much on the San Andreas and the Hayward faults in Northern California. So we're going to jump into our panel discussion, and I'm happy to say that we have several of the folks that you saw on the video with us today for the panel. Dr. Christine Goulet, the Executive Director of Applied Science at the Southern California Earthquake Center, Lori Schumann, the Senior Program Director of Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners, Ross Stein, the CEO and co-founder of Temblor, and we are working hard to get Roderick Scott, the board chair of the Flood Mitigation Industry Association, on the line with us as well. So we've already actually received a couple of questions from the audience, so I will try and fit those in, but we're going to jump right in. And please, if you do have any other questions, let us know in the YouTube chat, and we'll hope to get to them. So let's start with Dr. Goulet. I'm going to call you Christine for this webinar. Of just a very basic question on seismic risk. So, in the video, we saw just how many faults there are throughout California. The state seems to be riddled with faults, but there's a belief with a lot of natural perils, whether it's earthquake or floods or wind, that if we made it through a 100-year event, and we hear that term a lot, a 100-year event or a 500-year event, and since most of us aren't going to live to 100 years, we kind of figure out, okay, that's it, I'm good, I don't have to worry about another event in my lifetime, it's not going to occur for another 100 years. Right? Or if I made it through this one and I didn't die and my house survived, then I must be okay for the next one. So what is wrong with that attitude?
So the main issue with this is that we think in terms of our lifetimes and so on, and the Earth as a dynamic structure functions over hundreds and thousands of years. So we think that an event that happened every 100 years, it's a blip in the time scale of the Earth. So the big issue we have is that our prediction of when the earthquakes will occur are based on long-term interval and what we inspect from the faults and so on. And so we kind of average those. And for each fault, there might be a recurrence interval of 100 years, but that could be 50 and then 350 one time. And then we have all those different faults as well. So we cannot think in those terms. And even the building code is based on a 2% probability of collapse in 50 years. That corresponds to 2,500 years. That's more in the kind of time scale that we think about. But we really think in terms of tens of thousands of years.
Thanks. Well, there's also a belief that, earthquakes are such sort of a rare event, or more likely they're so uncertain, right? We never know when an earthquake is about to happen. And so that there's sort of this throw up your hands. If you live in California, it's just sort of a crapshoot, we can't do anything. So what are you doing at SCEC around the science of helping people better understand earthquake risk and forecasting?
So along these lines, collecting all the data on the recurrence intervals of different earthquakes, we dig trenches, we look at the record in the earth of past earthquakes. That's how we get those long-term events. And yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but is it because we have uncertainty or things we cannot pinpoint exactly that we're going to stop? No, we do the best with what we have. We continue to collect data and we keep updating models. So we do earthquake forecasting, which is not prediction. A prediction would be there would be a magnitude 7.8 at this location on that day in that time. We don't do that. What we do is forecasting. So the operational earthquake forecasting is a big area of research where different people develop dozens of models and try to predict the seismicity and what's happening. And we, in real time, test those things through catalogs or earthquakes that really happen and tune those models. So I do think that the earthquake forecasting is something that we're getting better at. But again, it's about collecting the data. And saying it's a crapshoot is a simplification of the issue. It's really the best science, and that's why models of earthquake ruptures are updated regularly. We collect more data, we think more globally about the different faults and how they interact among themselves, because a fault rupture doesn't happen in isolation. We have fault systems, and through this, we improve the models and have new generations. But we don't change suddenly completely the predictions or the forecasting. It's just really refinement, and that's the beauty of science. There's a lot to be done and more data to be collected so we can refine the models.
Wonderful. So we got a question from the audience. I think it's a great question, and so I'm going to ask Ross to answer this, and then Christine, if you want to pipe in with any additional comments. So the question, it was like we hear about, and we mentioned this a bit in the video, we hear about the San Andreas fault, the Hayward fault. This audience member asked about other faults, like the Walker fault or some smaller faults that we don't hear of, they don't get a lot of the attention. There can be a little bit of a, I don't know if we do ourselves the best service if we only talk about where the earthquake occurs on what fault, Ross. It's more like where you live, what's the chance of strong shaking happening, regardless of what fault it's on. Shaking can be shaking. So is there a different way that that engineers sort of characterize risk as opposed to, a magnitude X event on the Y fault?
Well, first of all, the 2019 Ridgecrest earthquake, which was a magnitude 7, followed 36 hours later, or was a 6.4, followed 36 hours later by a 7.1, occurred on faults we didn't know. Faults we know about in California. So, great geologists have tread the whole state. It's probably among the places on Earth with the best known set of faults, and yet we've still had damaging earthquakes on faults we were unaware of. And that's a reminder that what you're saying, not just thinking faults, but thinking about your chances of being shaken from all earthquakes, large and small, near and far, are what we really have to focus on. And we have a lot of fantastic clues for this, because the faults, what's happening is they're straining the Earth. So the Earth is being distorted by all the faults, which slip freely at some depth, about 10 miles down, and are stuck in the upper 10 kilometers. So we measure this with GPS receivers. Believe it or not, GPS has more to offer you than car navigation. And that tells us where things are straining, and where things are straining, ultimately, we will have earthquakes. So there's a lot of different ways to understand the earthquake peril, and it shouldn't be just limited to faults we know well about.
Yeah, and that's just go ahead, Christine, please.
So I'd like to add to that. That's a very, very good summary, and I think there's a misconception by the public in general that we design for magnitude event. We design for ground motion, right? The building code is based on designing for a certain level of shaking and ground motion, and that's really what matters. And yes, that's done usually in a probabilistic way and so on. And the current models of the fault ruptures, because we start with the fault rupturing and then we predict the ground motions from that. Given this event, what is the ground motion? We do that for all the events we expect and so on. And then the models that provide this recurrence of earthquakes on different faults and so on actually accounts for events that on off faults or where we don't know that we have faults. And the magnitude goes from 7.3 to 7.9, pretty much anywhere outside of the faults is accommodated by that model. So it's not because it's not on a known fault that it's not somehow integrated. Of course, it's less, it has a lesser weight, but it's still considered in part of the design.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, Ross and Christine, Dr. Stein and Dr. Goulet are really experts when it comes to understanding ground motion. They're also really experts when it comes to communicating this risk. And so, understand what they're saying is that California has faults we know about, faults we don't know about. And it's really about the risk of strong shaking. That's how we design our buildings to code. And that's what we think about, regardless of specifically, the name of the fault or the specific location of an earthquake. So I'd like to turn now, actually, we're gonna move for a second away directly from earthquakes and talk to Lori Schumann. Lori has some really unique experience having been to Puerto Rico, which is such an unfortunate island, has been subject to earthquakes and hurricanes. And she's really seen the effects that it has on the population. Lori, I've interviewed you in the past, and there was something that you said once that struck me, is that, you found Puerto Ricans to be some of the most resilient people you've met, that, regardless of the risks and that impacts they face, they have this ability to be personally resilient. But, that isn't enough to ensure the resilience of our communities, right? And so Can you talk a little bit, based on what your experience there in other parts of the country, what the U.S., what cities and the states and the federal government need to be doing to help these communities really become more resilient and able to recover?
That's a great question, Evan. And I just would just remark that, in general, and the work that we do across the country, communities that have been living with lower incomes, that have been trying to build housing and materials and life support without a lot of resources, are incredibly resilient, because you have to be. You have to know how to survive in a moment where there may not be a lot of resource. So that means a lot of community groups are formed. There's a strong commitment to faith, and faith-based institutions support a lot of life functions like shelter, feeding, and services. So essentially, there's a starting place where communities are already coming from a place of innate strength. So my question really is, how do we harness that? And then fundamentally, what are the material supports that we can provide as a nation to help communities be able to fortify their homes? I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to having the material support and the technical assistance necessary to fortify homes. Not every homeowner will have the funding to rebuild their home or to fortify their facilities. So at the end of the day, you have to be able to stand up, support in a material way to support the needs of housing. And that gets back to code, that gets back to having a program. Rod had mentioned it, whether it's the PACE program or others. I really like the weatherization program because it helps to support construction and retrofit without the owner having to outlay a lot of money. But at the end of the day, like you said, when we talk about hardware versus software, what's going to save you in an earthquake? It's going to be your hardware, your buildings, and your software is going to get you through the trauma and the service needs.
Great. Laura, we're going to come back to you with another question in a second, related to public policy. Ross, I wanted to just, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot in this series is sort of performance-based design and functional recovery. We've talked about the differentiation between what the code provides and what the public expects or may need in terms of the ability of their buildings to withstand natural disaster. So can you talk a little bit about what this term functional recovery means, and maybe bring in even a little bit larger how that relates to the interdependencies that you talked about, that 1,000 points of light that you talked about in the episode?
Well, when you look at it, as great as the building code is, it's shockingly inadequate. The function of the building code is that the building, after the design earthquake, won't fall down, but it'll be a total loss and will need to be scraped away and will never be occupied again. Whose idea of recovery is that? It's the absolute minimum that we should be thinking about. And looking forward, it's ridiculously low. So what we all want, I don't think it's any shock to anybody, is after the earthquake to be able to live in shelter with your family, to be able to work so you can earn a living, to be able to communicate. So you need all that infrastructure, you need power, you need water, you need markets to be open. That's how we get back on our feet. And if all we are going to say is lives are not lost because the buildings stay up, but then they have to be scraped away, we're nowhere. And we can do better. So the difference between a building that simply doesn't fall down and a building that could be occupied the day after the earthquake, believe it or not, is not that great. The engineering required to go from that really abject state to a fantastic one is relatively modest and is feasible right now. So that's the idea of functional recovery, is that the impact of the earthquake is brief and we can get back on our feet and rebuild what is needed rapidly. And that should be everybody's goal. This should be no surprise.
Great. And we're going to get into that a little bit with Rod in a minute. But Lori, back to you. You have your finger sort of on the pulse of public policy trends, both at sort of state and national levels, about how codes, standards, incentives around climate change are making us think differently about certain types of buildings, particularly affordable housing and, say, small businesses. What are you seeing as, especially as the infrastructure and the reconciliation bills are working their way through Congress? What do you see about the trends in public policy toward addressing this idea of resilience, particularly of our vulnerable housing populations and smaller businesses?
Well, Evan, I'm really happy to report that now that we have a new administration in place that values the efforts around climate resiliency and understands that we are, as a nation, facing incredible risk, that climate change is proving to be one of the most material risks that our generation faces, and that unless we deal with this, we're going to be just pushing the legacy down the road for our children and grandchildren to deal with. And we risk a state of absolute catastrophic impact. So the new Biden administration has put forward several pieces of legislation and a series of executive orders that asks the agencies to step up and provide both adaptation plans, which just came out 2 weeks ago, to look at what the agencies are doing to support adaptation around climate change. And the other thing that the administration has done is to ask agencies to map how their programs and policies touch disadvantaged communities. This effort is called the Justice 40 effort, and this is sending out a signal to the states and municipalities, as well as to investors and regulators across the nation, that this is serious business, that we mean that this administration cares and is also willing to put in significant financial commitment into this work. And so right now on the Hill, there's really intensive debates happening to try to figure out if the president's vision and the commensurate funding that he has appropriated for the sport is going to be available to the nation. So this is a big question, and it's really important that we have this in mind. The other thing I want to mention is that there's a lot of interesting work happening in the investor community, in the investment space, signaled by the commitment that the leading agencies around financial regulation have. The SEC, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve are all standing up climate resiliency efforts. And so they're also sending out a signal to the markets. And so this is absolutely influencing how our housing and real estate partners and developers are going to be moving forward. So this is a good time. Hopefully the reconciliation passes and we'll have more funding to work with. So this drives the carrot and it drives the stick.
Thanks, Laurie. That's great. Yeah, I just so deeply appreciate the work that Enterprise is doing, and it's really helped sort of change our own conversation in the USRC about focusing on the resilience of our vulnerable communities and getting engaged at the national level. I wanted to ask Roderick Scott a question. I'm not sure if we have his video, but Rod, is your mic on? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to wait a second until or I'm going to move on if we can't get Rod back. But because I have some great questions about what the work he's been doing in flood. We have flood the thing about earthquake hazards is, of course, they occur infrequently. Floods occur every year, and so in some ways, what the work that's being done at a national level on flood mitigation really can help lead the way in looking at other hazards and how we can address mitigation. So just checking one more time, Rod, do we have you on? Okay, I'll get back to that. So Christine, let's talk about, again, let's expand on this issue of interdependencies. Okay, so both you and Ross mentioned that in the video. When we think of resilience, it's easy to focus on the things that we see, the buildings. But of course, there are lifelines, utilities, transportation networks. In the Northridge earthquake and in the Loma Prieta earthquake, we had huge damage to our transportation infrastructure. There's also the telecommunications infrastructure that we don't see, but we deeply rely on. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the interdependencies of these systems in relation to our building infrastructure, and what some of the biggest risks we face about making sure that our infrastructure is resilient too.
Yeah, so this is a very good question, and it piggybacks a little bit on the functional recovery that Ross talked about. We want to be resilient in the short term, so be able to operate, but the long term is also very important. But in the short term, let's take the example of a hospital. I really like that example because you have a big shock, whether it's an earthquake or floods, and you have injuries and whatnot. You need the hospitals even more than ever. So what if the roads are damaged and the medical personnel needs to take care of emergencies at home and all that, and they cannot get to the hospital, and maybe the earthquake triggers some liquefaction and landslides that break water mains also, and pipes, gas pipes, and electricity. So how do we remain functional? You retrofit the hospital. That's good. A lot of them now are being put on base isolator to minimize the damage, the structural damage. But overall, this has to operate as a whole system. You need to have the supplies of medications, the electricity, and all that. So I like the hospital for that purpose, because it gives us an idea of everything that needs to work. The difficulty is that all these things we rely on, as you mentioned, even all the lifelines, they're distributed over a large area. So it's not like we can suddenly just fix one area of this system. We need to think about them as a whole system. And in that sense, we need to think of the spatial correlation of the ground motions. And it might not be where we have the largest shaking that we have the biggest damage to the system. Maybe there's a single component or a place, a fault crossing, you can mitigate a little bit, but maybe there's a component, a pump, that is on liquefiable soil, and there's less shaking, but liquefies, and suddenly the whole system is paralyzed. So the whole idea here is we need to think of resilience as the resilience of a system, and the resilience of a system of systems. So in that we have, again, water, electricity, gas, telecommunication, but also the people. We need to integrate the communities in that resilience. So from the engineering perspective, which is what I tend to think more about at first, is really thinking of a system-wide design. So you need to find what is the weakest point, and you use also the hazard and what you know about the hazard to then prevent and mitigate and retrofit. But you also need to consider the fabric of society and the different communities, because without the people, there's no society. So there's no resilience to be had. And everybody plays a role in making the society function. So we need to do system level engineering and design, but broader system even. The resilience involves the system of peoples and the system of the infrastructure. And so in a nutshell, that's what we need to do. It's really hard, but we need to get there.
Thanks. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, it may sound on the outside like this is just such an interconnected web that we can't possibly model all this. But the good news is that we do actually, we presented this on a couple of previous episodes. We had Kurt Hazelton at HB Risk on, who has developed software that can model all of California or the Southern California area in a repeat of the 1994 earthquake or a projected earthquake. And he's done models like this to see what the area-wide, the regional impact might be, in the same way that, we do hurricane forecasting, what the impacts would be for hurricanes. We have that capability not to predict, again, as Dr. Goulet said, not to predict when the event will happen, but to forecast the impacts if an event will happen. And we're also able, there's a lot of research being done, and there's some good university work being done on modeling lifelines as well. So the good news is, with the knowledge we have about the seismicity in the United States, the quality, if you will, and the characteristics of the assets and the computing capabilities that we bring to it, we are able to now start looking at these full system-wide effects. It is challenging, but we're getting better at that every day, and so we can start to make decisions based on the whole impacts to a society. So I'm going to move on a little bit and talk about some of the financial aspects of resilience. We're going to talk a little bit about insurance, about lending, and about other kinds of incentives. So Ross, let's start with you. You mentioned this in our interview, talking about insurance. Some people think that insurance companies prefer to cover more risky properties because then they can just charge double or triple the rates and make more money. But in fact, insurance companies really prefer to insure lower risk properties and sort of, mitigate their own risk. Why is that? Can you tell us a little bit about the process that insurance companies go through when they're looking for properties to insure?
In a nutshell, the more uncertain the losses are in an earthquake, the more expensive insurance gets. It's not just the amount of your losses, it's how little we know about it. And if you have an old, unretrofitted building, it's kind of a wild card whether or not how it will perform. And that causes these large uncertainties, which lead to uncertain results and expensive insurance. So insurance companies like exactly what we want. They want the most earthquake-worthy house possible to insure because they know that their losses are going to be capped. So ironically, their goal and our goal is the same. The more we've retrofitted our home or bought or live in a more recently built home, the better insurance risk we are, which simply means that the chances of a large payout are low because we're going to go through this event really well.
That's wonderful. Thanks. Yeah. Now, if you're a homeowner in California, you typically receive in your regular insurance, you receive a notice from the California Earthquake Authority that says, hey, you can get earthquake insurance. And for single family homes, the CEA has actually done a really great job in incentivizing and promoting the idea of retrofitting your home, bracing and bolting the house to the foundation, bracing the water heater, a couple of other things. They recognize that when you do that, you reduce their risk. And so they have offered insurance discounts. That's also done with wind. The fortified system by the Insurance Institute for Building and Home Safety offers discounts that can be as much as 50% if you strap your roof down, put storm shutters on, other things like that. So we do see this way to incentivize lower risk in the single family sector. But private insurers, who are mainly responsible for sort of larger multifamily and commercial properties, it's much harder to find those discounts. So what are some ideas that you might have about how insurance companies could and should be incentivizing resilience?
So of course, the problem, if you were an insurance company, you would say, show me the data that this retrofit commercial building will fare better in an earthquake or has fared better in an earthquake than others. And fortunately for us, we haven't had a lot of recent evidence to put on the table. I mean, Northridge earthquake was a long time ago, 25 years ago, and Loma Prieta was even longer in California. So we have relatively little data to go by. So there is a tendency to ignore what you can't demonstrate to yourself with actual insurance claims, the payouts. Nevertheless, there's abundant evidence that buildings built better perform better. So there really should be no excuse for not offering this. In a sense, insurance companies are offering this discount, but it doesn't appear this way. Essentially, what they're doing is not providing insurance to the buildings that aren't retrofit. They're not even providing it at all. They're basically cut out of the deal. So if you think about it that way, in fact, if your building is retrofit or if your building is more recently built, you're going to get offered insurance, which is essentially the same thing as giving you an incentive discount.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ross. It looks like we're having trouble getting Rod Scott on, but I've had a lot of conversations with him. And so let me talk a little bit about this idea of, we talked about insurance. There's also lending, how banks think about risks. A bank checks your credit when you buy a property, whether it's a house or, a 20-story office building. They want to make sure that you can repay the loan, right? That's really what they care about. But they also want to make sure that the property itself is going to be something that you want to continue repaying the loan on. So if that property is damaged in a flood or an earthquake, wildfire, hurricane, and it's heavily damaged to the point where it exceeds the borrower's equity, there's a risk that the borrower is going to walk away and just leave the bank with the loan. That's the borrower's option, actually. And when that happens, the bank is left with an asset that's highly depreciated because it's been damaged, and it really has no interest in repairing it. So it ends up taking a huge loss. So it's in the bank's interest as well to lend on properties that are at lower risk. And again, we see this a lot in flood, particularly because it happens over and over again, particularly in places like the Midwest. We see it in flood because there is a federally subsidized program for flood insurance, which regularly underprices the risk so that the federal government continues to, pay out more than it takes in flood insurance. So there's been a lot of motivation around ways to mitigate flood damage. And so recently, January 1st this year, the Storm Act was signed into law. And the Storm Act, while it says storm, it's actually available for all hazards, including earthquake, wildfire, wind. What it does is it allows for individual states and communities within those states to set up very low-cost loan funds. And these loan funds, and I'll describe them in a second, these loan funds allow cities and states to make low-interest loans available to a private property owner. It could be for a house, but it could also be for a restaurant or a hotel or a larger building. And this would allow the owner to seismically or wind or flood retrofit that property. And the advantage of this type of loan, there's two advantages. The first is that it's a very low cost loan. And the second, or low interest loan, like 1% to 2%. And the second really interesting advantage is that they are tied in with the property taxes itself. So it becomes what we call a PACE type loan. Rod mentioned this in the video, that we have PACE type programs right now if you want to install solar panels on your roof. If you're a homeowner, you may only own the house for 10 more years. You go through this big effort of installing these solar panels. The new owner gets to take the advantage of those solar panels. So the price of the solar panels are actually folded into the property tax assessment itself over 30 years. So the new owner continues to pay their share of this loan. And so the same would work with mitigation. So if you own an office building or a small retail shop and you put in $100,000 through one of these loans, that loan is spread out over 30 years and attached to the property of the building. So even if you don't own the property, you sell it after 5 years, it's the new property owner that continues to pay that. So you as the owner don't have to foot the entire bill. And this gets to the thing that we've been talking about a lot. Dr. Goulet, Ross mentioned this earlier. We've mentioned in other episodes that everybody benefits when we raise the performance and the resilience of our building stock, right? And so if everybody benefits, then there should be some way to share the costs. And these kinds of Storm Act low interest PACE style loans are really a new and exciting way to sort of share that benefit and that cost over a larger group. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And the U.S. Resiliency Council is working with Rod and some of his colleagues to consider how those types of revolving loan funds might be funded in California, particularly for retrofit. Okay, so we're going to now, the third item that we're going to talk about, and then I know that we have a I'd like to bring Ross back in a second, but is we've talked about insurance, we've talked about lending. Let's talk about tax incentives. Okay, that's sort of the other big pot, if you will, of potential funding to encourage people to build more resiliently. So I'm going to come back to you, Lori. You mentioned in our past discussions how low-income tax credits can be used as a way to incentivize resilience. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what a low-income tax credit is, how they might apply to, say, the owner of a multifamily apartment building or a small business. How can they access these credits for resilience?
So I would say that when developers are looking at building properties in an area, the first thing they want to look at is where they're building and what the risks are and the vulnerability of the site. At Enterprise, we've developed a tool called Portfolio Prep, and this is essentially a back of the envelope quick scan of what vulnerability that particular property or address faces. And we looked at the combination of social vulnerability as it's designed and outlined by the CDC, along with the climate vulnerability as it's determined by the mapping or the particular climate risk from a variety of federal data sources. So anyone who's going into building anything that gets any kind of funding from, whether it's LIHTC, whether it's straight lending, loans, whether it's getting incentives to the opportunity zone, whether it's looking at getting funding that is supported by CRA lending, CDFI lending, these owners are going to, developers are going to want to make sure that their property and their asset is going to be whole, and that you're going to be able to design the facility so that it's going to be able to stand up against a variety of climate hazards. The reason why you want to do this is not only to protect your asset, to protect the tax credits. If you're getting those tax credits, you have to give investors assurance that you're going to have people living in those units. You're also going to want to make sure that you are going to receive a decent insurance policy, so you're not going to be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on insurance. So these are all the reasons why you should be building in a resilient way. We want to build housing that's affordable, that lasts for generations, and not just and doesn't fall apart if there's a big event.
Thanks, Lori. And so following up on that, so, Enterprise Community Partners, you're one of the largest sort of nonprofit providers of capital, as I understand, for affordable housing development. So what is Enterprise doing? How has it made it part of its own sort of policies and guidelines to think about resilience?
So we've got a really strong, robust program that we've stood up at Enterprise. It is dedicated to building resilient futures and building homes that are going to be able to stand up amidst a variety of shocks. And we have committed to this work at the very highest level of the organization. We have a strategic plan that we just rolled out a couple months ago, and this is highlighting that resiliency is one of the top 3 pillars of our organization. And so we are following the vision that's set forward by our CEO in a variety of ways. We've got lots of great work we're doing around solutions and providing technical assistance to communities across the state. We just launched a California-based effort last week, which is looking at building community resiliency and building strong communities. And we've got a website that's up that's going to be able to provide a variety of frontline communities with supports to understand what federal funding looks like. How do you step up to the plate with mitigation planning? So we are committed to this. We've got 11 markets across the country that are following our strategic plan. We've got solutions that we've created, policy that we promote at the state and federal level. And then we've got a whole capital division that has lending products that are aimed at supporting equitable communities and equity and resiliency in general.
That's wonderful, Lori. I hope that this can become a model for both for lenders, for other lenders, when it comes to their strategic planning for resilience. In fact, USRC has already had some conversations with some large lenders about making these things part of their lending requirements, but also philanthropies and donors. You know, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have a couple very large tech firms that are planning on funding affordable housing in the Bay Area. And boy, you know, we really want to make sure that they add in that resilience component. And it's not just about getting up as much as possible, as quickly as possible, right? So Ross, as we work towards the end of the questions today, why don't you give us your thoughts on what the top few things that commercial, multifamily, or you know, individual owners should be doing to improve their resilience?
First, we should all remember that nearly everything we love about California has been brought to us by the faults. You know, absent the San Andreas and Hayward Fault, there would be no San Francisco Bay, the only deep water port along the California coastline, and so the wellspring of the gold rush. In Southern California, the Santa Monica Malibu Fault gives us Malibu, and the Hollywood Fault uplifts the Hollywood sign. And the San Jacinto and San Andreas faults give us Palms. If it weren't for these faults, none of us would live here. It would be a pretty uninteresting place. So we drink from the fruit of the faults every day. And so we have to learn to live with their occasional spoils. And what do we do? What do we need to do to prepare for that? Well, of course, we should all have the MyShake app on our phone that will alert us within several seconds before strong shaking begins. Temblor produces its own free app, the Temblor app, which tells anybody what the severity of shaking is expected in your lifetime and what you can do about it. Everybody, here's my keychain. Everybody should have a whistle on your keychain. This is a Marine International Orange whistle, very loud. I never lose my keychain, so it's a real benefit. But if I'm trapped in a building in an earthquake, nobody's going to get me unless they know I'm alive, and I can't yell for very long. And beyond that, everybody should have an earthquake emergency kit. On Temblor's website, we show what we think should be in there. We don't sell them. But my suggestion is, as we approach Christmas and Hanukkah, that think about giving an earthquake emergency kit to the people you love as an expression, as a way to say, we want you safe, and this is what you need to do so. And going out from there, yes, make sure that your house is as earthquake safe as possible. And the several $1,000s that you might expend doing that will be so rewarding to you when that earthquake finally occurs. So there's lots of simple things we can do to enjoy this beautiful place that the faults has bequeathed to us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ross. What about on the commercial side, though? If you could just expand a little bit about what commercial owners of larger properties should be doing as a first step towards becoming more resilient.
Commercial owners need to protect their building and protect their employees so they can continue to run. That problem is really now looks different to us in the post-pandemic or pandemic world. And so it's not just a matter of the building, it's a matter of where everybody lives and their commute and their ability to get to work and perform their jobs even if they're working from home. So suddenly a building owner should concern themselves with the seismic safety of everybody's home, not just the office or the manufacturing plant itself. And so this conversation, Evan, that you're creating here is one that every business should have with its employees and saying to them, hey, have you retrofitted your home? Have you insured your home? What are you doing about it? How can we help to make sure that you're safe? Because if you're safe, you're going to show up and work. And if you're not, you're just going to be understandably worried about your family. So in other words, the business should share this broad interest in making sure we're prepared.
Wonderful. And last question then to you, Christine, similar question. On the public side, the public sector side, what are the top couple of things that you think the public sector should be doing to improve community and regional resilience?
So I think we want to continue in doing individual building retrofits. That's really good. But having incentives is really important, and also improving policies and making them a bit stronger in some cases could really help. broader than that, and it's beyond just the public sector, is all the lifelines. Some are privately owned, some are public, and so on. But thinking about the resilience issue as a system-wide performance-based design. So system-wide because of all the interconnectivities and also with society. And performance-based to go beyond that building code, that's the bare minimum, and also that doesn't apply to a pipe. And so it's really important to go there. And what I think is really important for the audience to know is that this is where the research is going. It's been going for a couple decades now on the performance-based design, and both for the quantification of hazard and the engineering performance and all that. And the goal, again, as Ross stated, in other words, we need to reduce those uncertainties. And that's where the research is going. And research is translated into practice over time. So this is really, I guess, positive that this is what we're working on. It's a difficult problem, but we have a lot of people working on this. And we're going to get through that. And the goal is to improve. Resilience is never done. The goal is to improve gradually. And as we get more information, get better models, better assessments, and do better.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. That was just a sort of a great sort of broader discussion. I'm sorry Rod couldn't join us, but I really appreciated his comments on the interview, on the episode. So with that, let me again just thank our panelists, of course, and our promotional partners. Again, this involves everybody working to get the notification of this series out, do the registrations, participate on the panels. Christine and Lori and Ross and Rod, it's just great for you to take your time to join us. And thank you for to our partners. I would be remiss if I didn't remind you all that tomorrow is the Great Shakeout, right? October 21st. And so it's a time for you to practice your drop, cover, and hold. It's a time for you to talk to your employees about what they're doing for seismic resilience, as Ross talked about. It's time for you to check your own emergency kits and just sort of reflect on the fact that we live in earthquake country, and it's not a matter of if the earthquake happens, but a matter of when. And so we hope you'll commemorate that. I'm also asked from time to time about the USRC. We're a nonprofit organization. We would love to have the continued support of all of you. Feel free to go to our website and consider joining or contributing to the USRC. And we encourage you to register for our next and our final episode in this series, November 17th, a series recap and review. To let you know, starting in January, we are planning to launch a new style of Resilience Advantage educational effort through more targeted webinars, which we hope you'll be able to attend as well. So again, thank you so much for attending today, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Enjoy the rest of your day.